Hey, so what are you doing? I'm reading my work. Hi, it's Sonia here of The Pretty Stitch with another episode of Yarn Matters. So today we're going to be talking about reading our work. So what does that mean? To me, it means knowing what your stitches look like, knowing what you're creating, knowing what you're knitting or what you're crocheting or whether you're doing Tunisian crochet. I feel it's important to know what stitches you're actually creating and what do they look like? What are they supposed to look like? So the reason why I decided to talk about this topic is I am in charge of a knit and crochet group at my church, and occasionally I will do like a little class. I mean, most times we just, we sit and talk and we knit or crochet, and each of us kind of does our own thing. But occasionally, people will ask me, to teach a certain stitch or whatever. So last time I taught a little class at my group, I noticed some of the people, they had trouble reading their work. So what does that mean, at least to me, is they didn't recognize whether they were creating a knit stitch or a purl stitch, or what a single crochet is supposed to look like or a double crochet is supposed to look like. So I find that if you want to be really successful at crocheting or knitting, you really need to know how to read your work. So let's say if you are, let's talk about knitting. If we're knitting and you're creating a knit stitch, you need to know what it looks like. If you're creating a purl stitch, you need to know what it looks like, because there are certain stitch patterns that incorporate either the knit stitch or the purl stitch. So if you don't know what you're exactly doing or what it's looking like, then you're going to really have a hard time creating that particular stitch pattern. And the same applies with crochet. If you're making a particular crochet pattern and it requires you to make a certain amount of double crochet or triple crochet, single crochet, you really need to know what those stitches are to look like. So that means reading your work. And also, when you know how to read your work, then you can also see if you're making it right, like you're working on a pattern and you're reading your work and you're like, oh, this is looking how it's supposed to look. That's a good thing. Or it could be the other way. You're reading your work and you're like, oh, we have a problem here, and you can spot your mistake. So I just find that that's just a little tip. So if you're just starting out, whether you're knitting or crocheting or doing Tunisian crochet, get familiar with the stitches. When I was teaching, for an example, a particular class, I was talking about, we had to do a couple knit stitches, and then we would have to do a couple purl stitches, or I would say, okay, you're going to knit in every knit stitch and purl in every purl stitch. And some people were like, well, what's a knit stitch? What's a purl stitch? Now, the funny thing is, some of these people were actually pretty skilled at knitting. They had been knitting for a few years, but they really weren't familiar with the stitches, which sounds a little strange. So they could execute the stitches. They, like if I said, oh, do a knit stitch, they could do it, but they weren't really familiar with what it actually was made up of, if that makes sense. Same with a purl. If you're making, they knew how to make a purl stitch, but when I would say, okay, now make sure you knit in every knit stitch, purl in every purl stitch, they're like, well, which one's the purl stitches and which one are the knit stitches? And I was like, okay, you've been knitting a really long time and you don't know what the knit stitch is supposed to look like, or the purl stitch. So that's what I feel. Getting familiar with the stitches, when you're creating that knit stitch, what is it supposed to look like? When you're creating that purl stitch, what is it supposed to look like? And that will just help you when you are reading patterns, if you want to do that. So then if it will say, okay, knit in every knit stitch, purl in every purl stitch, you'll be like, oh, well, these are knit stitches and these are purl stitches. So these knit stitches, I must knit in them, and these purl stitches, I must purl in them. And also it helps you to spot mistakes easier or work stitch patterns. And the same thing definitely applies for crocheting. If it's saying, okay, make sure you work a single crochet in every single crochet stitch, if you have no idea what that looks like, then you're going to run into some problems. So how to learn how to read your work is when you are learning to crochet or learning to knit, whatever stitch you're executing, look at it, study it. And it doesn't have to, I mean, I'm not talking about school. It really doesn't have to be work. But especially if you just want to crochet and knit as a hobby and you're like not that serious about it. But even if you're not that serious, I do feel like you should know what you're doing. You shouldn't just be blindly making these stitches and have no idea what they're supposed to look like, because you just aren't going to be very successful in a pattern if, you know, it's saying to single crochet in every single crochet stitch and you're like, I'm not sure, maybe this one's a single crochet, and you're actually putting a single crochet in a double crochet stitch. So again, just get familiar with the stitches. If you're learning how, like let's say you're following a YouTube tutorial, I do have some, if you want to learn to crochet, I have some videos that walk you through it and be like, okay, we're learning a single crochet stitch. This is what it's supposed to look like. Does my stitch match up with what's on the video? And same thing applies with knitting. I mean, the two basic stitches of knitting are, the foundational stitches of knitting are the knit stitch and the purl stitch. So I feel like at least with those two stitches, you really should know what they look like. You should know what a knit stitch looks like and what a purl stitch looks like. And it's pretty easy to differentiate between the two. Like, they don't look exactly the same. So I just thought I would touch on this topic just to encourage you, if you are a beginner knitter or crocheter, or even if you've knit and crocheted for a while and you're still having trouble like actually knowing what you're doing, to just get familiar with the stitches. Like if a pattern is saying, okay, knit 5 stitches, and you knit those 5 stitches, look at it, study it, and be like, oh, okay, this is what my knit stitch looks like. And same thing with the purl. If it's saying purl 2, look at the stitches and be like, this is what a purl stitch is supposed to look like. So again, it will help you down the road if you're creating something, and then you can be like, oh, this is coming out great, I'm on the right track, I'm doing the right thing. Or you'll be like, this is not right. And also it will help you, because if you don't know how to read your work and you've worked really hard on a project and then you're like, oh, I'm done, and then you look at it and you're just like, well, that doesn't look right. Why doesn't it look right? I have no idea, because you didn't know how to read your work. So I just want to encourage you, if you really, love to knit and crochet, just to learn how to read your work. Study the stitches. Like if you're working on a pattern, just be like, okay, I'm making a knit stitch, this is what it looks like. I'm making a purl stitch, this is what it looks like. So I hope this was helpful for you, and I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please like and subscribe. And if you didn't, that's okay. Just scroll on by, and I will see you next time.